Welcome back. Jeffrey Epstein is due back in a New York court later today, where he is expected to learn from a federal judge whether or not he will be granted bail as he awaits trial on new sex crimes charges involving children, underage girls. And we have an update now on the footage found by our Morning Joe producers from back in 1992 that shows Trump watching and commenting on women with Epstein, who is now a sex offender and accused sex trafficker, at Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. This is when it was private. It was not a club yet, open to others. According to the New York Times, that party took place the same year Trump hosted an off-camera affair with Epstein at Mar-a-Lago, during which they were the only male guests. And they had more than 24 what they're called calendar girls flown in to provide them with entertainment.
Wait, you mean the only people at this meeting?
Epstein and Donald Trump and 28 young women.
You mean just because there's Donald Trump and Epstein and a lot of others. You're saying in that event, they flew in 28, quote, calendar girls? And are you saying it was the only people at Mar-a-Lago at that party?
And Trump.
Were Epstein and Donald Trump?
And in that video that we unearthed, you see Epstein, another man, and Donald Trump leering at women, sort of salivating and looking at them as they're dancing, and making some sort of comments that cause Epstein to double over in laughter, this sex offender who is accused of sex trafficking. But in the background, you see Ghislaine Maxwell. I'm not sure if I have her name right, but she is a British socialite who is accused of being Epstein's recruiter of underage girls.
His pimp.
Who brought them in, recruited them, and gave them money. And she's there in the background at the, see, there she is with the white shirt.
So
she's dancing or something. I don't know what she's doing.
This tape helps because I now understand when Donald Trump said in 2002 that he loved, what did he say? Jeffrey Epstein was a great guy, and he really loved women, just like Donald. That he loved women almost as much as Donald did, but that he loved really young women. I guess we understand. Look at these two looking at women and pointing at them.
Can't get over themselves. Yeah. So anyway. President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office last week, that he had a falling out and was not a fan of Jeffrey Epstein. I guess this is when he was a fan. While the nature of Trump's falling out with Epstein remains unclear, the Times reports Trump told associates that he banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago after a worker at Trump's club was recruited to be a masseuse for Epstein. While others close to Epstein claim a business transaction related to a Florida property ended their relationship. In 2016, the paper says then-candidate Trump's allies worked to minimize his association with Epstein, while noting that former President Bill Clinton had also been friends with the wealthy financier. It also reports that during a deposition in a 2010 lawsuit accusing him of trafficking children for sex, Epstein declined to answer whether he and Trump had ever socialized in the presence of underage girls.
So, John Heilman, we're getting reports this morning from Vanity Fair that there are about to be 2,000 documents that are going to be released in the Epstein case, which will likely reveal the associations between Epstein and a number of extraordinarily powerful men, former prime ministers, high-ranking American political officials, CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. It reminds me of something that you said early in the 2016 campaign cycle, when you and a lot of other reporters were trying to figure out exactly what was going on with Epstein and who he associated with that was involved in the presidential race. It seems nobody was able to nail down that story, at least during the campaign. But Julie Brown and the Miami Herald have now put everybody in a position where in a few days they may be finding out the answers to a lot of those questions.
Yeah, and I think, look, Joe, one of the things that's the reason why this story is not over by a long way, and not only is there more to play here related to Jeffrey Epstein, but also related to others, potentially including the current president of the United States, is the fact that what the prosecutors have discovered in that safe and in Jeffrey Epstein's home includes a lot of documents and a lot of video, apparently, which may prove to be not just embarrassing but incriminating, related to the behaviors of various individuals. There's been a lot of speculation about the extent to which some of Epstein's wealth was derived by blackmailing powerful individuals in the worlds of politics, finance, technology, and philanthropy, and whether there is the basis of that blackmail rests in his possession, things that are now about to become public in the course of this investigation. So there are a lot of people, I think, nervous about this, and there's a sense, I think, that, I mean, certainly the most high-profile person now, that New York Times story mentions, it is the case that Bill Clinton had association with Jeffrey Epstein and took flights around the world with him. That now has kind of faded from at least the center of this story because of the fact of the Donald Trump Association. So you guys did some incredible work there unearthing that video. The New York Times now picking it up and doing some more investigation here. As you know, there have been some pretty disturbing allegations that had surfaced in the past related to Donald Trump. In the 2016 campaign, Jane Doe lawsuit was filed, later withdrawn, that accused the president on the premises of Jeffrey Epstein of engaging in sex crimes. That lawsuit was withdrawn after the lawyer for the woman said that she'd faced death threats. But that was written about then. It was there were stories written about it in the press in 2016, and I think you are likely potentially to read some more stories about that question. And I'll say the one last thing is that there was on the internet for a period of time, not that long ago, on Vimeo, the deposition of that Jane Doe in that lawsuit was on Vimeo just a few days ago, and now has suddenly disappeared from the website, which has raised some questions among people who are following this case about what happened to that videotape deposition, which made some allegations against the current president of the United States.
Yeah, Yamiche, over the course of 30 years or so, as John said, there have been some very, very powerful men in the orbit of Jeffrey Epstein who have socialized with him. And many prosecutors, some of them who've actually worked in the Southern District, have raised a red flag for us that the fact that the Public Corruption Unit is leading this investigation in a sex trafficking case perhaps indicates that a public official, either current or former, is involved here.
It seems clear that there's going to be this widening net of people around Jeffrey Epstein, powerful men likely, who partook and who were breaking the law right along with him. President Trump has been trying to really distance himself from Epstein. I was there on the lawn when he walked out, Secretary Acosta, and essentially publicly saying, you know, he's become a distraction. We need to put this behind us. But it's clear that President Trump isn't going to be able to put Jeffrey Epstein behind him that easily. I also think the president said something on the lawn that stuck with me, which was that he said, well, I wasn't on the island that Epstein had, but there were other people that were. You should check into that. And I think what the president was doing there was saying, don't ignore the parties that I had maybe in the United States with Epstein when we flew in girls, up to 28 women, to have our private party. But let's look at other islands, possibly in St. Thomas, that locals were calling Pedophile Island. I think that we know it's pretty clear that Epstein was using his wealth and using his access to young women, to these children rather, and inviting other people to abuse them. I think we're going to have to see more about who those people were. But it is clear to me, and I think to a lot of other reporters just looking into this, if it's in this unit, they're obviously wondering who else is going to go down. And Jeffrey Epstein himself is probably also wondering, if I'm going to take the fall, who else am I going to bring down with me?
All right, coming up, New York Times columnist Tom Friedman says it's not enough for Democrats to just point out Donald Trump's racism, that they need to do something about it. And he has a specific idea. We'll tell you what it is ahead.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.